Hello and welcome to this presentation of Herald-Standard.com Editorial Board meeting. Mark O'Keefe, Executive Editor, who's generally our moderator, is attending a conference today, and I will serve as moderator in his absence. My name is Terry Snead, and I'm Managing Editor of Content for Herald-Standard.com. Our special guest today is Senator Pat Toomey, Congressman from Republican from Pennsylvania, and he has with him some staff members. If you'd like to introduce them.
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm John Frick. I'm the regional manager for Senator Toomey. I'm responsible for the Johnstown office and the surrounding counties, which includes Fayette and Greene.
Matt Blackburn, I'm the Senator's Western Pennsylvania Director.
Nahama Soloveitchik, I'm the Senator's Communications Director.
Also with us today are members of our editorial board, our publisher Bob Pinarski, publisher emeritus Val Lobb, community member of the editorial board Bill Long, and editorial board member and iMedia director Joanne Hunt. So Senator Toomey, I want to thank you for coming in, taking your time to be with us today. And would like you to just start out and just tell us some of your initiatives, some things that you're working on. I know you were touring an industrial site and park site in Fayette County today. So
sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate your making the time, and look forward to this discussion. This trip today in Fayette County, I'm going up to Westmoreland County from here. Just part of an ongoing effort to be reaching out to Pennsylvanians and learning as much as I can about what's important to the people in the various communities across the Commonwealth. Let me just touch on a couple of the sort of aspects of the work that I've been doing in Washington. I'll start by saying very candidly it's been very frustrating. We really do have a largely dysfunctional government. We have a completely unsustainable fiscal dilemma facing us. We're spending far more than the federal government really can afford to be spending, in my view, running deficits that are over $1 trillion a year for the last 4 consecutive years. This is completely unsustainable. And I spend a fair amount of my time trying to, I sit on the budget committee, I've got a background in finance, and I do spend a fair amount of time trying to find a way that we can get our fiscal house in order, and it's for several reasons. The most obvious of which is it's completely unsustainable, and we will have a full-blown fiscal and financial crisis if we continue down this road indefinitely. But also, it's important because as long as the federal government is running an unsustainable and really fiscally dangerous and imprudent policies, it's contributing to the chilling effect on our economy. Rational business people are going to be much more reluctant to invest, to expand their business, to hire new workers, to do the kinds of things we want, while the threat of a financial meltdown, massive inflation, huge tax increases, or some combination, as long as that threat looms. And so I think it's really important, not only in its own right, but it's important for the sake of our economy, that we get our fiscal house in order. Second big area that I do focus on is regulatory areas where I think specific regulations are misguided or excessive, or where the benefits can't be justified by the cost that they impose, especially as they pertain to Pennsylvania. And it's something I'm constantly looking for input from constituents about regulations that just don't make sense, whether it's regulations on municipalities. There are an amazing number of federal mandates on our state and local county governments, and these are almost invariably, these are cash-strapped municipalities that are having real trouble making ends meet, and yet the federal government is very happy to impose new costs on them. It's also true on the business side. I would argue we have had an unprecedented wave of regulation that is having a chilling effect on our ability to get out of this economic turndown. And this is part of why I think this recession has been so long, the recovery is so weak, actually unprecedented since the Great Depression. And I think it's largely because of misguided policies on the part of Washington. So I spend a fair amount of time on these two fronts. One last point I make, because every once in a while we do something right, and we seldom talk about that much. But we had a case of bipartisan cooperation that resulted in what I think is some very good law. And the story goes, it actually started with the president. To his credit, the president appointed a commission, mostly private sector people, and asked them to look at all the various regulations that make it harder for businesses to raise capital, especially growing businesses that need capital, and make recommendations for how we might change them. Well, these folks, they did their work. They took it seriously. They came back with a whole series of proposals, and I have a background in finance and a background in business, and I looked at this and I saw a number of proposals that made a lot of sense to me. So I decided to draft some legislation. And actually, the first thing I decided was to find a Democrat in the Senate who would work with me, because nothing happens in the Senate unless there's bipartisan support. And I was able to do that. Chuck Schumer and I teamed up on a bill that makes it easier for companies to go public. Tom Carper, Democratic senator from Delaware, he and I teamed up on a bill that allows privately held companies to include more shareholders to raise capital privately. And John Tester, the Democratic senator from Montana, he and I worked on another regulatory reform aspect in the same space. So while we were pushing this legislation, the House decided to roll up the companion measures that they had on their side of the Capitol, together with two additional measures. And they passed it. The president endorsed it. And we were able to really insist that the Democratic leadership in the Senate put this on the floor, because it had broad bipartisan support. It had passed the House. The president wanted to sign it. We had all the pieces. And Harry Reid did put it on the floor of the Senate. We had a debate, and we had some amendments, and we argued about it, but we went through the legislative process that we frankly ought to do more of. In the end, it passed the Senate overwhelmingly. The president signed it into law. And today there are companies going public that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to go public. There are companies raising capital privately that needed the capital and weren't able to access it. So I'm not suggesting that this legislation alone is going to, suddenly turn around our economy overnight. It won't, but it will help. It'll help on the margins, and it's an example of how we do occasionally manage to get things done. Unfortunately, we don't do enough of this. I think we ought to legislate more often. I think Harry Reid should open the Senate floor process to a process of open debate and amendment, and allow the Senate to work its will as it's supposed to. But it's not entirely a functional body right now. So I hope that'll change soon. And if Republicans are in control, which I think is actually fairly likely next year, many of us have made it clear to our elected leadership, we don't want to run the Senate the way Harry Reid's been running the Senate. We ought to do a budget, for one. That's appalling to me that we're 3 consecutive years without even having a federal budget. I wrote my own, because I just think it's completely unacceptable for either party, frankly, whether you're the majority or the minority, but most of all, if you're the majority party, to suggest that you don't have a responsibility to even submit a budget, I think is outrageous. So I introduced my own. I think that ought to be a given. I think we ought to have as open an amendment process as possible. We ought to have debate. We ought to discover where the consensus is within the Senate in the ordinary legislative process, and we ought to be a lot more productive. So those are a couple of thoughts, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Senator Toomey. Yes, we can start with our questions from the editorial board, and I'll take the first question. And it's a regulatory matter, hot issue in our area, more on the environment.
Mm-hmm.
What are your overall thoughts of the Marcellus Shale natural gas industry? Multifaceted question here.
Yeah.
Can it be done safely and productively? Do you think the state's Department of Environmental Protection is doing a good job in regulating the industry right now? Or do you think the federal government, the EPA, should become involved in regulations?
Yeah, so as you say, it's a multifaceted question. First of all, I think the discovery of truly staggering volumes of natural gas is extremely encouraging. It's very, very good news for the American economy. the price differential between natural gas and oil is already at levels, as I'm sure you know, that makes it more economically efficient to even move vehicles by burning compressed natural gas rather than gasoline or diesel. This has never happened before in human history, right? That we have had a credible substitute for gasoline and diesel. And not only do we have a viable substitute, but it's cleaner burning, it's domestic, and it's in Pennsylvania. This is really terrific news. Now, it's only terrific if we do it safely and responsibly. And the good news is I've been persuaded, and I have personally toured drill sites. I have looked at this many times in many ways. There's no question in my mind that best practices are very, very safe. The EPA will acknowledge that there has not been a case in recorded history in which fracking fluids have made it into drinking water. It hasn't happened. There's no reason why it needs to happen. What we've got to make sure is that it's properly regulated up to the standards of the best practices in the industry. I happen to believe that the DEP is capable of that. I think they ought to have the resources to make sure that they've got the manpower to handle a big volume increase that we've had. But I don't think that we need to have the federal government come in and impose a new overlay of regulations on top of what the DEP already does. The drilling requirements, best practices actually differ in different locations depending on the formation through which you're drilling and the nature of the topography and the local conditions. The DEP knows that better than the EPA, frankly. And for the EPA to come along and just impose another whole layer of regulations would certainly increase the cost, but it's not at all clear to me that it would have any net beneficial effect. So I think we're better off continuing to have the DEP regulate this.
I think you hit on all the facets of that question.
Yeah, at least several.
Very good. Bob, would you like to take the next question?
Well, I think this is a really important issue to this county. Fayette County has one of the highest unemployment rates in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
You touched a little bit earlier about the regulations on business.
Right.
What else can be done to improve that rate in Fayette?
Well, I think I know that the development of Marcellus Shale is helpful to Fayette County. Fayette's not the biggest player, obviously, in this space, but the economy here can benefit from ongoing development of this. I know that coal is still an important part of the economy of southwestern Pennsylvania generally, and Fayette County. Now, I will say this is an area that goes right to your question, because the EPA under this administration is extremely hostile to coal. I think sometimes they're pretty open about that. They would like to see an end to coal-fired power plants in America, and that would be devastating to the economy of southwestern Pennsylvania generally. And it would be bad for Pennsylvania as a whole, and frankly America as a whole. Almost half of all of our electricity is produced through coal, and there's a reason. It's because it's domestic, it's affordable, it's available, it's reliable, and when you have lower cost energy, you help all aspects of the economy. So I disagree with the effort on the part of this administration to get so aggressive with especially coal-fired power plants that we're shutting them down. As you know, 6 in Pennsylvania have already announced they're closing, just shutting down, losing many hundreds of jobs directly in both the power plants and in the coal industry, but indirectly jeopardizing more jobs, because it's going to mean we're going to rely on more expensive alternative sources of energy that make manufacturers and producers and consumers less competitive. So I think sensible regulation is an important part of allowing this economy to grow.
Al, would you like to take the next question?
Absolutely love to. It's commonly known that you oppose Obama's health care.
Right.
And, but it's been passed in law.
Right.
And so that being the way it is, are there aspects of that law that you agree with, disagree with, would like to see changes going forward to that, or any comments you'd like to make along those lines?
Sure. No, my preference is we repeal this whole thing and take a different approach. What we ought to be thinking. Yeah, I know you're shocked. I know you're shocked. You're stunned. But no, it's fundamentally the wrong direction, if you ask me. And we can achieve what the goals ought to be: affordability and access. What we want is for more people to be able to have access to good quality health care, and for health care to be more affordable, because of escalation in costs are very, very problematic. This law, I think, is a disaster on many, many levels. It's terrible for the economy. It imposes all kinds of new taxes, direct taxes on employment at a time when we've got too many people out of work. To make it more expensive to hire a worker is a really bad idea. We're going to dramatically diminish the freedom of patients to make decisions about their own health care. You may have seen there's an editorial in today's Wall Street Journal about what they're doing in Massachusetts as a direct result of the approach that they've taken there, which is very similar to Obamacare. They have now established a government commission that is aggressively taking direct control of even pricing of healthcare. Every doctor, every healthcare provider is being forced to register with the state as a condition of having a license, reporting how much money they make, what their pricing structure is, what their market share is, and this commission is empowered by the legislation to void contracts, establish new prices. Really, it sounds as though they have virtually unlimited power to remake the model for healthcare. This is the opposite of freedom and the opposite of the direction I think we ought to be going. So what I'd like to see us do instead is, first of all, encourage an evolution in the market to more individually owned and controlled health insurance. So if we started by equalizing the tax treatment, the asymmetry in the tax code that allows employers to deduct the cost of health insurance when they buy it for their workers, but does not allow an individual to get the same treatment if he or she goes out to buy it on their own, creates the incentive to have employer-provided health care. That takes decision-making out of the hands of the employee, and by the way, it's the real source of the pre-existing condition problem. Right? The problem of a pre-existing condition comes typically when you lose your job or when you want to switch jobs.
Right.
But you don't own that insurance plan, and so when you lose your job, now you have to get on a new insurance plan because it wasn't yours. You have a pre-existing condition, and that's a problem. So I'd like to see us move in the direction where individuals have a chance to decide a plan that works for them and their family. Insurance companies should be made to compete very aggressively for that individual business. That's part of the reason I like the idea of forcing insurance companies to compete across state lines. Let's have all the competition in the world for health insurance like we do for car insurance and other kinds of insurance. I think we do tolerate a level of cost that's actually quite significant in the form of excessive litigation. And that's not just the direct cost of the litigation, but it's the indirect cost of defensive medicine. And I think the last big thing in this piece, I think, is that I've met with a lot of healthcare providers, including, for instance, a network of children's hospital anchored by CHOP in Philadelphia, who will tell you that they can deliver health care to needy families, in their case, pediatric health care to needy families, much, much better and at lower prices if they were freed up from the mandates imposed through Medicaid. But they don't have the flexibility to do this. If we gave states more flexibility to design their own health care programs for the poor, if we made Medicare more responsive and more driven by consumers, I think we would have normal competitive forces would make it more affordable and more accessible. And that's better than what this bill does.
So let's change it.
Hmm?
Let's change it.
That's the plan.
All right.
That's the plan.
Good.
As soon
Thank
as
you
we
very
have,
much.
as soon as we have the votes to do it.
Thank you.
You've already touched on the next question, but perhaps we could still hone in on it a little
Sure.
bit more. It pertains to the coal industry from
Okay.
Bill Long.
Thank you. Coal is still a big industry in our area. Do you think it's being overregulated? What can be done to help the industry further develop? And do you think we have coal mines and clean air at the same time?
Yes, and that's obviously very important. As you probably know very well, if you look at a graph of any pollutant you choose to pick, and you look at the volume of those pollutants in a coal-fired power plant over the last 30 years, it is a steep, steady downward decline because we've made great progress.
Right.
And I don't want to push back on any of that. I'm delighted we've made that progress. In fact, I'd like to see us make continued progress. But we've got to be realistic about how much progress we expect to make overnight and at what cost. Because what the administration is doing, I think, is intentionally setting the bar so high, so suddenly, they know the coal-fired plants can't comply, and that's what they want. They want them to shut down. So I just disagree with that approach. I think you can have ever cleaner air. The air over Pennsylvania is much cleaner now than it was in the 1970s, for instance. That's terrific. I want to take all those gains and make more over time, but I want to do it at a pace that's manageable. As I said earlier, coal is a really important basis for that basic electric load, and it's a reason that we can have reliable, low-cost electricity, and we should not be throwing that out.
Joanne, next question, please.
Yes. What do you think of the U.S. economy overall? And what can Republicans do to try and make it better?
Well, I think the economy overall is really terribly underperforming. 42 consecutive months with unemployment over 8% is completely unacceptable to me. And the worst economic recovery since the Great Depression is unacceptable, and I think it's unnecessary. The employment numbers, we got a pleasant surprise on Friday, a bigger number than we were expecting. But if you average that out over the last several months, we are not even creating enough jobs to accommodate the new entrants into the workforce, much less to create the jobs to bring people back. The unemployment rate, I think, disguises the true magnitude of the problem, because the headline rate is 8.2%. But that's done, as you know, through a methodology that excludes from consideration all the people who've given up hope and aren't even trying to find a job. And it excludes from consideration the people who are underemployed. They've got a job, but it's not giving them the hours they need. It's not the job they want. So if you take those factors into consideration, realistically, the unemployment rate is closer to the mid-teens, and that is absolutely horrendous. So I think we've got a terrible economy. After every other recession, we've typically had what they call a V-shaped recovery. The economy goes down and it spikes back up. You recapture the lost ground, so to speak, and get back onto the path that you would have been on if you'd never had the recession. We're not doing that at all. We're just sort of meandering along, barely on this side of another recession, and I feel like we're vulnerable to one at any time. The wheels come off in Europe, which could happen at any time. That could trigger it, any number of things. My view is it's a combination of three things that are causing this miserable recovery. One, it is a series of tax increase and the threat of massive tax increases right around the corner. Two, it is a completely unsustainable federal budget that has investors, and by that I mean small business, medium-sized business, really all categories, worried about the threat of big inflation, high taxes, some combination. And then the third thing is just really excessive and imprudent regulation. Obamacare is one example. Dodd-Frank is stifling access to capital. We talked about the EPA and what they're doing to coal, but I hear it from people about OSHA and the NLRB and regulator after regulator. And I think there's a mindset in this administration, frankly, that is, I don't know if hostile is too strong a word, but it's not very friendly to people who want to launch businesses and grow existing businesses. It's a mindset, it's a kind of gotcha mindset. I don't know if you saw that video of the EPA regional director who used this metaphor of, what was it, what the Turks did when they conquered a new town in ancient days. They hung the first 5 adult males they found from a tree branch and left them up there as a message to the rest, and that's what we're going to do to these oil companies. What kind of attitude is that? That's not. This is our government. They're supposed to work for us, all of us, and so I think that this combination is the reason that we don't have the economic growth we ought to have, and I think what we ought to do is push back on this. So we need to get our fiscal house in order. We should avoid a massive tax increase. We have sensible regulations, but not over-regulation. And if we did those three things, you add to that the benefits of really low-cost natural gas and virtually unlimited supply, and I think we could have a terrific recovery. And that's what I think we should shoot for, and we shouldn't settle for anything less.
Well, do you think the Republicans, I mean, do you think they have an opportunity at all to work with Obama? I mean, do you think that on the economy, do you think that's going to make a difference? Or
Unfortunately, he's comes from a very different place. You know, philosophically, he just totally disagrees. He thinks that we need more borrowing and spending. He thinks that will be good for the economy. There's another good piece in today's journal from Art Laffer, where he lays out the data. I mean, the facts are what they are. And the countries that engaged in the biggest increase in so-called stimulative spending in recent years had the worst economic performance. This is something that the president and his team don't want to acknowledge. They think you can borrow and spend your way to prosperity. I think you can't. That will never work. If it did, then we'd never have a recession. We'd just have the government just constantly borrowing and spending, and we'd all be doing wonderfully. That's not productive. The source of wealth of a society is what it produces. And the government taking on a lot of debt and spending money doesn't enhance production. So it's going to be hard to work with the president on these things because he has such a fundamentally different view. There are some exceptions. This bill that I alluded to during my comments about reforming some of the regulations on raising capital, the president signed that bill into law, much to his credit. My concern is he's running a campaign where he's offering to just double down on these policies that have failed us. So if he gets another term, I'm not optimistic about how much he's going to want to take a different approach.
thank you.
Speaking of another term, the race for the White House appears to be a rather close one.
Yeah.
So what are your views of the presidential race? Do you know Senator Romney? Do you favor his views? What do you think the prospects are for a change in administration overall?
Yeah, I do know Mitt Romney. I've met him on a number of occasions, had a chance to campaign with him and spend some time with him a few weeks ago. Actually, one-on-one, he's an extremely friendly and personable and down-to-earth guy. For a guy who's been as successful and as wealthy as he is, you'd never know it. He's just a very, very pleasant guy. Most importantly, I think he understands what makes an economy work. He understands how you create an environment so that a small business person will decide to expand that business, to hire another worker, to launch a new business altogether. He totally gets that because he's lived that. And so I do think that he would be a huge improvement. I think his prospects are pretty good, but I agree with you. It's close right now. My guess it probably stays close for a while, but I think Governor Romney will be very competitive in Pennsylvania. I think he can carry Pennsylvania. I think I was able to carry Pennsylvania in 2010 in similar proportions to what he can certainly do in 2012. I don't know why he can't do at least as well as I did in 2010. He's executing well, and he's raising money effectively. You need to do that to have an effective campaign. He hasn't been able to start spending it yet, but when he does and starts to spend money in comparable proportions to the president, I think we'll probably see his numbers improve. I think he'll get a bounce from the convention. Probably gets a bounce when he makes his vice presidential pick. And I think I feel very good about his prospects.
Okay, thank you. We have exhausted all of our formal questions, but maybe the board members would have some others. The country's defense or the sustainability of Social Security were just a couple thoughts that I
Anything
had.
else you'd like to comment along those lines would be great for us. But Social Security would be a very good one to speak to.
Sure. Well, you know, when I was on the super committee, one of the big focus for me was to try to fix the problem we have, right? The fiscal problem. And the fiscal problem is driven by the big entitlement programs. The most recent deficits are caused by these giant stimulus bills, but if you look going forward, the simple fact is that no big government program can grow faster than the economy indefinitely. It's just arithmetic. It'll consume everything. Right? So you can't do that. Well, all three of our biggest entitlement programs are growing faster than the economy. Now, the least problematic of these are Social Security, because there's a dedicated revenue stream that's almost enough to cover that cost. With some pretty modest reforms, can really put Social Security into a relatively safe place for a very long time. So the more urgent entitlement problems are Medicare and Medicaid. Take Medicaid. If you include the Medicaid program itself and the related mandatory health care entitlement programs other than Medicare, so just health care for poor Americans, that is, under CBO project, Congressional Budget Office, their forecasts are for that program to grow at an average rate over the next 10 years of over 11% per year. I mean, that's nominal growth. If you take their projections for our economy, they estimate that it'll grow at 5% per year. We're not reaching that now. We can hope we get to that. But in any case, that has Medicaid growing at twice the rate at which the economy is growing, right? And meanwhile, you look at all the state governments, every one of them, it seems to me, maybe there's an exception I'm not aware of, but most of them certainly, are cutting back in all kinds of areas, including higher education, for instance. And the reason is because Medicaid is consuming ever more of the resources they have. We've got to change this structure. We've got, and so this is what we tried to do in the super committee, to say, look, let's make some changes to the design of these programs so that we can make sure that people who really need these programs will get them, but we've got to put it on a sustainable path. And I was very frustrated we couldn't get that agreement. But I really think that's, we're going to do it at some point. The question is, will we do it now when we have the luxury of some time, the ability to borrow money at low rates,
Right.
or will we wait till the market forces it on us? And that's a very, very unpleasant place to be making those decisions.
How about in terms of defense spending? We've been pouring a lot of money into Iraq for years,
Right.
and Afghanistan. How do you view the spending levels? Would you continue the same path, or?
Well, so again, a multifaceted question, right? And
Yes.
as you know, right, the drawdowns in Iraq and Afghanistan are resulting in huge reductions in the amount we're spending for those operations. Defense spending as a percentage of our economy is actually not that high. It's well below previous higher levels, and in fact below the post-war average. So by that measure, we're not spending as much on defense. My own view is that the way we ought to approach national security is to ask ourselves very carefully, what are our needs? What are the legitimate security needs of our country? And then you fund those the most efficient way you possibly can. I'm afraid what we're doing now is the other way around. We're saying, well, gee, we're broke, so we better cut defense pretty heavily, without asking ourselves, well, is that going to leave us with a defense budget that's adequate for our national security needs? So I think we've got that a little backwards. Now, that's not to say that Pentagon spending should be off the table. The Pentagon is one of the least efficient places in all of government, and there's a lot we need to do to save money, given the way it's spent. But I think this round of spending cuts that's coming up, the sequestration that kicks in January, is disproportionately weighted towards defense. Defense already took a big cut last summer when we did several $100 billion over 10 years in cuts, and now there's yet another round. This isn't just me saying that. The Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, has said that this is very imprudent, really. We can't afford to cut our defense budget to this magnitude. So what I think we ought to do is we do need to spend less money. I think we should reprogram the sequestration. Instead of the cuts to defense, the cuts need to go somewhere else. They still need to occur, but not nearly so heavily in the defense budget. Because I think it still is a dangerous world, and we are better off, and the world is better off, if we have a very strong and robust ability to project force. I think we should be very cautious and prudent about how we use that. But we should remain in the position where no rational nation state would ever consider engaging us in a military level. I want to be in a position where we don't have to go to war because someone thinks, they actually could win.
Right.
Are there any things from our questions, any matters that we missed that you'd want to speak on?
We expected this to ask.
We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, okay, okay.
What about with education? You know, the United States is falling behind the rest of the world, and I think it's affecting it here as well in Fayette County. Well, what is your stance? What direction do we need to be taking there to improve our standard?
Yeah.
Our stand with the rest of the world.
Well, I think you're right. It's a very big deal. If we're not competitive in the quality of our education, then our workforce is just going to be at a disadvantage that over time is going to be very problematic. As you know, the federal government historically has not played a big role in primary and secondary education, although it spends a lot of money in this area. I don't think that expanding the role of the federal government is likely to result in a lot of improvement. I think what we probably ought to do more of is shake up the status quo in primary and secondary education. We have a virtual monopoly in most places, and the more competition we introduce through charter schools, through private schools, competition usually leads to better service and lower costs. It does in every other aspect of our economy. I think it would in education too. It actually works pretty well at the tertiary level. Now, it's expensive at the tertiary level. That's another set of issues. But quality of education is actually quite good, and it runs the entire range from kids who need remedial help after coming out of high school to kids who are going to be Nobel Prize winners in physics and everything in between. We managed to do that in part because it's very competitive and kids have choices. You know, we have programs to help kids afford college, Pell Grant program for instance, but we never say you have to spend it at the college down the road. We say you can go anywhere in the country. What college is best for you? And so that forces the colleges to compete. And I think if we force that dynamic to a greater degree on primary and secondary education, we would probably have better outcomes than we have today.
Okay. Well, would like to thank Senator Pat Toomey for taking time from his busy schedule to join us today. Very informative discussion, and to his staff. And to our viewers and readers on Herald-Standard.com, we appreciate you watching, and we'll see you the next time.